Welcome to MantleSaga, where superhero legends begin. This is the timeline where Hulk does not simply destroy the heroes. He survives them, outlives Earth, and becomes something far worse than the monster they feared. But that ending begins long before Galactus arrives, in a quiet moment when the smartest men in the world convince themselves they are being rational. The decision to remove Hulk from Earth was presented as responsibility, not cruelty. The Illuminati looked at Bruce Banner and saw a pattern of disaster they no longer believed the planet could survive forever. In their minds, this was not betrayal, but leadership forced to make an ugly choice for the greater good. That logic hid something darker beneath it. Banner had always been a living reminder that power becomes frightening the moment it stops behaving the way other heroes want it to. So Reed Richards, Tony Stark, Doctor Strange, Black Bolt, and the others chose exile over understanding, putting Hulk on a ship and sending him into deep space as though distance could solve pain. But Hulk's life had never obeyed the plans of men sitting safely in rooms. Somewhere in the void, the course changed, and the ship was dragged off its intended path and cast onto Sakaar. Instead of peace, Hulk found a brutal world of slavery, gladiator arenas, and survival so savage that strength was the only language that mattered. And yet Sakaar gave him what Earth never truly had. In that violent world, he found brotherhood, purpose, and eventually something even more dangerous to a man built around rage: love. For the first time, Hulk was not just a weapon or an outcast, but a king, a husband, and the beginning of a future that felt like it might redeem everything that came before. That is why the next loss shattered him so completely. The very ship that had brought him away from Earth detonated in a catastrophic blast and destroyed the life he had built, killing the people he had finally allowed himself to love. To Hulk, it did not feel like an accident or tragic chance, but proof that the world he came from had taken from him one last time. So when he turned his eyes back toward Earth, he did not see home anymore. He saw the source of every version of his suffering, the place that had cast him out and then burned down the only world that ever made him want peace. And from that moment on, Hulk's return was no longer the story of a hero coming back to settle a score, but of grief coming home in the shape of a god of war. When Hulk returned to Earth, he did not come back as Bruce Banner asking for justice. He came back as a verdict, carrying the ashes of Sakaar in his heart and the memory of a stolen future in every step. This was not blind destruction anymore, but rage sharpened by grief and aimed directly at the world he believed had condemned him to endless loss. That was what made this war so much more terrifying than an ordinary superhero battle. The heroes were not facing a villain with a scheme to stop or a monster that could be calmed once it exhausted itself. They were facing a being who believed his suffering had. Earth's defenders responded the only way they knew how. Teams formed, strategies were built, and the machinery of the heroic world tried to reassert control over a crisis that was already slipping beyond it. But Hulk had moved past the old rules of heroism, and every attempt to restrain him only seemed to confirm what he already believed: that Earth's champions had never wanted to save him, only contain him. As the conflict widened, the damage spread far beyond the battlefield itself. This was no longer just Hulk's revenge against the Illuminati, or a temporary fracture in the superhero community. The entire heroic age began to buckle, because every major defender pulled into the war was one less shield standing between Earth and the dangers waiting beyond it. That larger danger was already there, silent and patient. The Skrulls had long been preparing their own move against Earth, placing agents, studying weaknesses, and waiting for the moment when the planet's protectors would be too broken to resist. Hulk did not know it, but every hero he crushed and every alliance he shattered made the world easier for hidden invaders to claim. That is the tragedy at the heart of this part of the story. Hulk believes he is punishing the people responsible for his pain, but the scale of his fury reshapes the entire planet. In trying to make the guilty suffer, he tears open the very structure that once kept Earth defended, turning personal vengeance into a global unraveling. By the time the war reaches its ugliest stage, the question is no longer whether Hulk can be stopped without catastrophe. The real question is how much of the superhero world will still be standing when the violence ends, and whether anything strong enough to protect Earth will survive what comes next. Because above the smoke of World War Hulk, another war is already waiting, and it is watching the heroes destroy themselves first. By the time the last countermeasure was considered, the heroes were no longer operating from confidence. Hulk had broken too many plans, overpowered too many champions, and forced too many brilliant minds to confront the humiliating truth that they were losing a war they had helped create. What began as an effort to contain a threat was becoming a fight to prevent total collapse, and fear was beginning to speak louder than principle. That was when Reed Richards and Tony Stark reached for the kind of solution that only appears when heroism starts to rot under pressure. They turned to orbital satellites designed to unleash overwhelming force on the battlefield itself, a weapon so extreme it erased the line between stopping Hulk and destroying everything around him. In their minds, it was necessity, but necessity in dark superhero stories often becomes the final excuse before disaster. There was nothing noble about what followed. The satellites did not descend like salvation, and they did not offer the clean precision their creators probably imagined when the idea first took shape. They turned the sky into a firing squad, transforming a battlefield filled with heroes, rubble, and panic into a kill zone, where the cost of failure would be paid by everyone still standing. So Earth's defenders were caught inside their own final answer. Powerhouses who had gathered to hold the line, heroes who still believed the day might somehow be saved, and fighters who had come to stop Hulk from dragging the world over the edge were all swept into the destruction together. In that instant, the superhero community did not just lose a battle against Hulk, it helped annihilate itself out of terror. That is what makes this moment so devastating in the larger story. The Age of Heroes is not ended here by brute strength alone, but by a collapse of judgment, by the willingness of great minds to turn panic into policy and devastation into strategy. The satellites become more than weapons in this scene, because they symbolize a heroic world so frightened of losing control that it would rather burn its own defenders than admit it has run out of clean answers. And still, Hulk survives at the center of it all. Surrounded by dead heroes, collapsing structures, and the smoking remains of one more attempt to stop him, he remains standing as the living proof that all this destruction achieved almost nothing except multiplying the tragedy. The battlefield becomes a graveyard, and the silence after the blast feels less like victory than the sound of a world realizing it has just crippled itself. When the smoke clears over New York, what remains is not peace, but a poisoned ruin. Radiation saturates the city, countless heroes are gone, and the systems that once protected Earth have been burned away in a single desperate act. In trying to destroy the threat at any cost, the heroes have shattered their own shield, and that broken world is exactly what the waiting invaders needed to see. Months later, New York no longer looked like the center of a superhero universe. Its skyline stood broken under a haze of radiation, its streets were empty except for ash and silence, and the city that once survived invasions and gods now felt abandoned by history itself. This was not the aftermath of a battle waiting to be rebuilt, but a graveyard so vast it seemed to accuse the living for remaining. That was where Vision found Bruce Banner. Not as the Hulk, not as a roaring force of vengeance, but as a frail man moving through the ruins and digging graves for the dead. Human, hero, stranger, it no longer mattered to him, because in the poisoned remains of New York, mourning had become the only duty he still believed he deserved. Even that act had turned into punishment. Banner could not survive long in the radiation unless he transformed into the Hulk, but each transformation felt like surrendering to the very force he blamed for everything around him. To remain Bruce was to die slowly, and to live meant becoming the creature tied to so much suffering, so every breath became a battle between guilt and survival. Vision did not approach him like someone asking a weapon back into service. He spoke to Banner like a witness standing before the last broken soul of a fallen age. What he revealed only deepened the horror, because the devastation in New York had not ended the nightmare at all. It had only opened the door for something worse. While Banner remained isolated in the ruins, the Skrulls had begun their invasion in earnest. The surviving heroes were overwhelmed almost immediately, and the world that had once been protected by legendary teams was reduced to scattered holdouts, hunted fugitives, and exhausted remnants trying to survive one more day. Even Wolverine had been removed from Earth because his healing factor made him too dangerous to leave on the board. Banner listened to all of it with the numbness of a man who could no longer separate his own pain from the planet's collapse. He had spent a lifetime fearing that destruction followed him, and now he stood among the graves in proof that maybe it always had. The idea of fighting again felt less like a chance at redemption than one more demand that he become the thing he hated most in order to serve a world already ruined. But Vision had not come to offer him comfort or forgiveness. He came because even now, in a world with every reason to fear Hulk, there were horrors only Hulk could face. So there in the glowing ruins of New York, with Bruce Banner standing among the dead and the city around him burning in invisible poison, the story shifted away from revenge and towards something even crueler, the possibility that the monster might still be needed to save what was left. What Vision offered Bruce Banner was not absolution, but responsibility in its ugliest form. Somewhere beyond the radioactive silence of New York, a handful of survivors were still resisting the Skrull occupation, still moving through the bones of a conquered planet, and still refusing to let Earth become nothing more than a world waiting for its final burial. They were not the Avengers as history remembered them, but the reduced and battered remains of a heroic age that had already been torn apart. The resistance was held together by people who, in another era, might never have been asked to carry so much. Hank Pym was still alive, brilliant and unstable as ever, trying to preserve some use for science in a world that had become almost entirely hostile to reason. Bucky Barnes had become the kind of leader Apocalypse creates, practical, hardened, and unsentimental, a soldier who knew how to keep broken people moving even when hope itself had become unreliable. Around them were scattered survivors like Cannonball and other remnants of the old world, heroes and fighters who had endured not because they were invincible, but because they had learned how to live after greatness collapsed. Their strongholds were not shining headquarters or symbols of triumph, but abandoned bunkers, improvised shelters, and forgotten facilities the Skrulls had not fully stripped bare yet. Humanity survived there in rationed food, whispered plans, wounded bodies, and exhausted eyes that still watched the dark for movement. At the center of that fragile structure stood Janet Van Dyne. In a world where raw strength had failed and larger icons had fallen, she had become something just as necessary: emotional gravity. She was the one turning fear into structure, giving people someone to follow, and making the resistance feel like more than a scattered collection of fugitives who had simply postponed death. That was why Hulk's arrival did not feel heroic when he entered their hidden world. It felt dangerous, almost offensive, because to many of the people still alive, Hulk was not just another weapon joining the fight, but the reason the fight looked like this in the first place. His war had shattered the heroic order, provoked desperate choices, and helped leave the planet exposed when the Skrulls finally moved. So asking these survivors to stand beside him meant asking them to trust the force they most associated with collapse. Banner understood that tension better than anyone in the room. He did not arrive demanding faith, nor did he pretend the scale of the threat erased the damage he had already done. He came because a dying world could no longer afford to reject the only force left strong enough to challenge what had taken it. And sometimes, in comic book tragedy, atonement is not glorious at all, but simply agreeing to be used one last time for something larger than your guilt. So Earth's last resistance accepted him, though not cleanly and not without fear. In the dim light of hidden bunkers, with Bucky measuring every risk, Janet holding together the human center, and survivors staring at Hulk as if he were both disaster and deliverance, the broken world made its most dangerous choice yet. It allowed its greatest shame to become its last hope. Once Hulk joined the resistance, the war changed shape almost immediately. Until then, Earth's survivors had been fighting like prey, hiding, scavenging, and striking only when desperation outweighed fear. Hulk did not bring caution with him, but impact, and the moment he began moving against the Skrulls, the occupation stopped feeling inevitable. The first victories were brutal and fast. Skrull outposts that had looked untouchable were torn apart in minutes, supply routes were smashed, prison camps were breached, and entire zones of enemy control collapsed under the force of one being who could hit like a natural disaster and keep moving. In a dead world where subtlety had lost much of its value, momentum itself became a kind of miracle, and Hulk gave the resistance more of it than they had seen since the planet fell. But the deeper shift was not military, it was emotional. Across ruined cities and hidden shelters, a rumor began to spread that sounded impossible and yet could not be ignored. Hulk was fighting for Earth now. For people who had spent months believing the age of heroes was over, that single idea carried enormous weight, because if even the monster most associated with the world's collapse had turned back toward protection, then maybe collapse was not the end of the story after all. That is how Hulk became more than a weapon. He became a symbol, though not a clean one like Captain America or any other uncomplicated banner of hope. He was proof that the force which helped destroy the world could still be redirected towards saving what remained of it, and in a universe built on masks, myth, and legacy that made him a different kind of icon, one forged not from glory, but from guilt. Banner felt the cruelty of that transformation every time he changed. The same power now liberating camps and crushing occupation forces was the power he had once used to tear through the superhero age. And the same roar that sent Skrulls running was the same sound many survivors still heard in nightmares. His strength never felt decorative in this story, because every act of violence carried the question of whether redemption could truly be built from the same hands that helped ruin everything. Still, the victories continued, and with them the resistance began to evolve. Fighting beside Bucky Barnes' dagger, cannonball, and the scattered remnants of a fallen world, Hulk helped turn survival into advance, and advance into belief. More cells emerged from hiding, more civilians were freed, and more people began to imagine that Earth might be more than a grave waiting to be sealed. That was exactly what the Skrulls feared most. Hulk's strength alone was dangerous, but the hope gathering around him was worse, because an occupied population can be controlled and a scattered resistance can be hunted, while a world that begins believing again becomes much harder to kill. So while Earth's survivors looked at Hulk and saw the impossible beginning of a comeback, the Skrull leadership reached a colder conclusion. If they wanted to crush this rebellion permanently, they would have to turn the hope rallying around Hulk into the weapon that destroyed everyone left. The Skrulls had never intended to win this war through brute force alone. Brute force was useful for occupation, for terror, and for reminding a conquered world who controlled the sky, but it was never their sharpest weapon. Their true strength was infiltration, patience, and the willingness to turn trust itself into a battlefield. From the perspective of the Skrull Bishop, Hulk's rise inside the Resistance was not simply a threat to be crushed. It was an opportunity waiting to ripen. One of his commanders questioned why their hidden asset had stayed dormant while Resistance strikes multiplied and entire Skrull positions were being torn apart. But the Bishop understood something deeper than numbers. Hulk's presence was doing the work of gathering every remaining survivor into one place. That was the cold brilliance of the plan. Before Hulk joined the Resistance, Earth's surviving heroes and fighters were scattered through bunkers, camps, and isolated cells, too fragmented to erase in one decisive stroke. But Hulk's victories gave them courage, his strength gave them momentum, and his example gave them a reason to rally, which meant the one force trying to save what remained of Earth was also concentrating it into a single, vulnerable shape. At the center of that fragile unity stood the one person nobody wanted to doubt. Janet Van Dyne had become the emotional spine of the Resistance, the figure who turned fear into discipline and made exhausted survivors feel as if they still belonged to something larger than ruin. She represented continuity, leadership, and the last trace of warmth in a world dominated by hiding and grief, which is exactly why the truth about her struck with such devastating force. Janet was not Janet at all. She had been a Skrull infiltrator for longer than anyone left could have imagined, embedded deep within the Resistance and helping shape it from the inside. Every word of reassurance, every decision that pulled more survivors together, and every moment that made the bunker feel like the beginning of a new heroic age had secretly been part of a design meant to concentrate Earth's last defenders into one perfect target. The revelation poisoned everything at once. The Resistance had not merely been infiltrated, but guided, arranged, and quietly sculpted by the enemy through the face everyone trusted most. Comfort became manipulation, structure became sabotage, and hope itself suddenly looked like a trap that had been patiently assembled around the people desperate enough to believe in it. Then came the final layer of the Bishop's strategy, the part that made the betrayal feel even more merciless. The Skrulls had not only placed Janet inside the Resistance because she could hold people together, but because of Hank Pym, whose unstable molecular condition made him uniquely vulnerable in ways almost no one else understood. They had studied the damage left in him by Pym particles and realized that his altered body could become something far worse than a hostage, and with every surviving hero now gathered close, all the Skrulls had to do was trigger the bomb already standing among them. When the trap finally closed, it did not feel like the dramatic reveal of a comic book conspiracy. It felt like the universe waiting until hope was strong enough to wound before crushing it in one motion. The resistance had gathered in one place because they believed they were becoming something real again, not just fugitives or survivors, but the beginning of a reclaimed Earth. And that was precisely the moment the Skrulls had chosen to strike. Hank Pym stood at the center of that design without knowing it. His body had been altered too many times, pushed through too many impossible scientific thresholds, and reshaped by Pym particles until his molecular structure was never truly stable again. What once made him brilliant and extraordinary had also left a weakness hidden inside him, one the Skrulls understood well enough to turn into a weapon. Then the plan became irreversible. There was no time for a noble final stand, no chance for the last heroes on Earth to form ranks and meet death on their own terms, because the betrayal moved too fast and the target was too tightly gathered. Hank's altered body was forced into molecular detonation, and in a single catastrophic instant, the bunker holding Earth's last resistance became the center of a new apocalypse. The explosion erased everything around it with monstrous efficiency. Heroes, soldiers, civilians, walls, plans, and the fragile architecture of trust the resistance had built over months all vanished inside a wave of annihilation so complete it barely felt like violence anymore. It felt like deletion, as if the world had decided that even the memory of organized resistance should be burned away. That was the true breaking point of the story. Earth had already suffered the collapse of its heroic age, the devastation of New York, the Skrull invasion, and the impossible gamble of trusting Hulk again, but even after all that there had still been something left to protect. Once Hank detonated, that final living core died with him, and the planet lost not just another battle, but its last meaningful chance at recovery. Hulk survived, because survival had become its own form of punishment for him. He was left standing in the ashes of one more catastrophe, watching the remains of the world's last defenders vanish into silence, with no army left to lead and no community left to mourn beside him. The final resistance, built painfully out of grief and necessity, had been wiped away in the space of a heartbeat. In the aftermath, something inside Hulk turned colder than rage. Until now, even his violence had still carried a purpose, whether revenge, guilt, atonement, or protection. But with the resistance gone, all of that burned away. Standing alone amid the ruins of the final explosion, Hulk no longer looked like a warrior trying to redeem himself, but like the last witness to a world so broken that even hope had been weaponized against it. After the explosion, there was no resistance left to lead, and no future left to imagine. Earth had become a planet of ashes, broken shelters, and dead symbols, and Hulk stood in that silence as the last being strong enough to understand the full scale of what had been lost. Rage had carried him through war. Guilt had carried him through atonement. But now both had been emptied out, leaving only judgment. That was the point where Bruce Banner crossed the final moral line of the story. He did not swear revenge on the Skrulls, and he did not cling to the fantasy that one more battle might somehow restore what had been erased. He looked at Earth, at the betrayal, the invasion, the fear, and the endless violence wrapped around his own existence, and he decided the world no longer deserved to survive. Somewhere in the wreckage of memory, Hulk recalled a buried fact from another chapter of his life. Reed Richards had once revealed the existence of a beacon hidden in a pocket of the negative zone, a homing device capable of summoning the Silver Surfer across the cosmos. In another kind of story, that knowledge might have become a final plea for rescue, but here it became a death sentence for the planet. So Hulk made his way to what remained of the Baxter Building, where Broken Genius still clung to the ruins like a ghost. There, among the remains of the world's brightest ambitions, he activated the beacon and sent its signal into the void. It was a fitting image for Earth's last decision, because one of Reed Richards' hidden contingencies was now being used not by a hero trying to save the world, but by the one being his choices had helped destroy. The Silver Surfer answered the call and arrived like something almost alien to the emotional ruin below him. He was calm where Earth had become hysterical, cosmic where humanity had collapsed into ash, and his presence made the planet's suffering feel suddenly small against the scale of the universe. But even he understood at once that this was not a summons for salvation, because Hulk did not ask for help, but ordered him to call Galactus and let the Devourer consume the Earth. Even in a universe built on war, that request carried a different kind of horror. Villains seek conquest, madmen seek chaos, and desperate heroes seek one more chance. But Hulk wanted obliteration because obliteration felt like the only honest verdict left. When the surfer hesitated, Hulk made it clear that refusal was no safe moral luxury, because there was still enough grief and force in him to make even a cosmic being understand the danger of saying no. So the Silver Surfer yielded, not because Hulk was right, but because the logic of the moment had become almost unbearable in its completeness. If Hulk was truly the last voice left to speak for Earth, then Earth's final request was death, and the Surfer chose to honor that judgment even as it sickened him. In the same breath, he reached his own breaking point and decided this would be his last act as Herald, because he would not remain the messenger of that ancient hunger any longer. And so the circle of tragedy closed back on itself. The same cosmic force whose destruction of the Skrull homeworld had helped set this chain of events in motion was now being summoned to finish the story on Earth. Beneath a dead sky and surrounded by the remains of heroes, invaders, and everything in between, Hulk stood alone and waited not for victory or redemption, but for the arrival of something vast enough to erase the final evidence that his world had ever existed at all. Galactus did not arrive like a conqueror descending into war. He came like inevitability, a force so ancient and immense that the collapse of Earth's heroes, the fall of its cities, and the grief of its last survivor all seemed to shrink beneath him. Against that presence, even Apocalypse felt small. And for Hulk, this should have been the end he had chosen, the final release after a life spent breaking everything he tried to touch. Then Earth died. The same world that had created Bruce Banner feared the Hulk, exiled him, failed him, and collapsed around him was swallowed by a hunger too vast to care about the meaning of any one tragedy. There was a cruel symmetry in that destruction, because the cosmic appetite that once helped drive the Skrulls toward Earth now returned to erase the very planet they had fought so hard to claim. For one brief instant, Hulk stood on the edge of the oblivion he wanted. He had not summoned Galactus out of ambition or madness, but because he could no longer imagine a future in which the world deserved saving or he deserved to survive inside it. Death was not surrendered to him in that moment, but the last honest consequence left in a story that had stripped away every softer ending. But Galactus did not offer mercy. He saw utility. With the Silver Surfer gone, the Devourer of Worlds stood without a herald, without the servant who crossed the stars and prepared planets for consumption. And in Hulk, he saw endless strength, impossible endurance, and a soul fractured enough to be remade into something useful. That was the final cruelty of the story. Hulk wanted to die with his ruined world, but Galactus refused him even that. Instead, he declared that Hulk would become the new Herald, the instrument sent across the universe to mark other worlds for annihilation, carrying destruction no longer as the tragic result of pain, but as his new function in creation. Then came the deepest violation of all. Galactus did not merely change Hulk's role, but erased his memory, stripping away every grief, every betrayal, every grave, every dead hero, and every reason Bruce Banner had begged for the end. None of it was healed or redeemed, only taken, leaving behind a servant with unimaginable power and no understanding of the world whose ruin had shaped him. So the story closes on something more haunting than death. Earth is gone, the heroes are gone, and Bruce Banner's history is gone, but Hulk still remains, rising into the black as the new herald of Galactus. He does not die as the last survivor of Marvel's darkest timeline, but ascends from it emptied of memory, remade into the first sign that somewhere else in the universe, another world is about to end.